Everything was synchronized. As one part was put on, another was ready.
In 1920, Walter Chrysler was one of the highest-paid executives in America. He had just walked away from a job that paid him $1 million a year, at a time when most families lived on less than $2,000. By 1925, he would launch a car company bearing his own name. By 1928, that company would become the third largest automaker in the world, right behind Ford and General Motors. And along the way, he would make enemies of nearly everyone who ever worked with him. This is the story of Walter Chrysler and how one man's relentless ambition transformed the automobile industry while leaving a trail of burned bridges, broken partnerships, and bitter rivals in his wake. Before this is over, we'll see backroom deals, hostile takeovers, stolen engineers, and a rivalry that reshaped Detroit forever. So let's begin. But first, where did Walter Chrysler come from, and how did a Kansas railroad mechanic end up running one of the biggest car companies on the planet? Walter Percy Chrysler was born on April 2, 1875, in Wamego, Kansas. His father was a railroad engineer, not the designing kind, the driving kind. Henry Chrysler spent his life hauling freight across the Great Plains, and young Walter grew up around locomotives, workshops, and the constant rhythm of iron wheels on steel tracks. By the time he was 17, Walter had dropped out of school to become an apprentice machinist at the Union Pacific Railroad shops in Ellis, Kansas. Now, here's the thing about Walter Chrysler. The man was obsessed with machines, not just interested, obsessed. He would take apart engines just to see how they worked. He would stay late at the shop, teaching himself the intricacies of valve timing and cylinder boring. Other apprentices went home at 5. Walter was still there at midnight, covered in grease, trying to figure out why one locomotive ran smoother than another. This wasn't just curiosity. This was something closer to compulsion, and it would define everything that followed. By his mid-20s, Chrysler had worked his way up through the railroad ranks. He became a roundhouse foreman, then a master mechanic, then superintendent of motive power for the Chicago Great Western Railway. He was good at his job, really good, and he knew it. But the railroad industry was changing. The future, Chrysler realized, wasn't in locomotives. It was in automobiles. In 1908, something happened that would alter the course of his life. Walter Chrysler attended the Chicago Automobile Show, and there, on the exhibition floor, he saw a locomobile. It was a white touring car, gleaming under the lights, priced at $5,000, nearly 4 times his annual salary. Most people would have looked, admired, and walked away. Walter Chrysler bought it, on credit, without knowing how to drive. I want you to think about that for a moment. This was a man making around $1,200 a year, and he went into debt for a car he couldn't even operate. His wife thought he'd lost his mind. His friends probably agreed. But Walter didn't buy that car to drive it. He bought it to take it apart. For the next 3 months, he disassembled that locomobile piece by piece. He studied every component, every gear, every bearing. Then he put it back together. Then he took it apart again. By the time he was done, he understood automobiles better than most people who designed them. This is important because it explains what came next. Walter Chrysler didn't just want to work on cars, he wanted to build them, and he was willing to do whatever it took to make that happen. In 1911, Chrysler got his chance. He was offered a job at Buick Motor Company, then a division of the newly formed General Motors, as works manager. The salary was half what he was making at the railroad. He took it anyway. Within a year, he had reorganized Buick's production lines, slashed manufacturing costs, and doubled output. Within 5 years, he was president of the company. Now, I should mention, Walter Chrysler was not an easy man to work with. He was demanding, impatient, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. He clashed constantly with Billy Durant, the founder of General Motors, over everything from production schedules to financial planning. Durant was a visionary, But he was also a gambler who liked to make deals on instinct. Chrysler was an engineer who wanted data, precision, and control. The tension between them was legendary. Durant would make promises Chrysler couldn't keep. Chrysler would ignore Durant's directives when he thought they were stupid, which was often. By 1919, the relationship had become untenable, and that's when Chrysler did something that shocked everyone in Detroit. He quit. He walked away from Buick, walked away from General Motors, and walked away from a salary that had grown to $500,000 a year. When Durant offered to double it to keep him, Chrysler said no. When Pierre DuPont, who was backing Durant's rivals, offered him a position, Chrysler said he needed time to think. What he was really thinking about was something far more ambitious. Walter Chrysler didn't want to run someone else's car company. He wanted to build his own. But first, he needed capital. And to get capital, he needed to prove he could turn around failing companies. Enter the Willys Overland Motor Company. In 1920, Willys Overland was drowning. The company had expanded too fast during the post-war boom and was now sitting on mountains of unsold inventory. The bankers who held its debt were desperate. They offered Walter Chrysler a contract to restructure the company for $1 million a year, just to consult. Chrysler accepted, but he had conditions. He wanted complete authority over operations. He wanted to fire anyone who got in his way. And he wanted equity, a piece of whatever value he created. The bankers agreed. They didn't have a choice. Over the next 2 years, Chrysler slashed Willys Overland's workforce, shut down unprofitable plants, and renegotiated supplier contracts. He was ruthless. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. Entire communities that depended on those factories were devastated. But the company survived, and the bankers got their money back. If you've made it this far, you're probably into this kind of story. Quick question. Where are you watching from right now? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We do this every week. All right, back to Walter. Because what happened next is where things get really interesting. While he was saving Willys Overland, Chrysler was also consulting for another failing automaker, Maxwell Motor Company. Maxwell was in even worse shape than Willys. The company had a reputation for building mediocre cars that broke down constantly. Sales were collapsing. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable. But Maxwell had something Willys Overland didn't. A group of engineers who had been working on a revolutionary new car design. The project had stalled due to lack of funding, but the blueprints were brilliant. The car featured a high-compression 6-cylinder engine, hydraulic brakes on all 4 wheels, and a lightweight chassis that promised better fuel efficiency than anything else on the market. Walter Chrysler saw those blueprints and immediately understood what he was looking at. This wasn't just a car. This was his future. He convinced the Maxwell board to let him take control of the company. Then, he poured every resource he had into developing that new car. The engineers worked around the clock. Chrysler himself was in the factory constantly, making suggestions, demanding changes, pushing everyone harder than they thought possible. The result was the Chrysler 6, unveiled at the New York Auto Show in January 1924. It was an immediate sensation. The automotive press called it the most advanced car ever offered at its price point. Orders flooded in faster than Maxwell's factories could fill them. Within months, the company had sold every unit it could produce. In 1925, Walter Chrysler formally reorganized Maxwell Motor Company into the Chrysler Corporation. The Maxwell name disappeared. In its place stood something entirely new, a car company built from the ground up around one man's vision. But Walter Chrysler wasn't satisfied with just surviving. He wanted to dominate. The mid-1920s were a brutal time in the American automobile industry. Hundreds of small car companies were being squeezed out of existence by Ford and General Motors. The survivors had to grow or die. Chrysler understood this better than anyone, and he set out on an aggressive expansion campaign that would make him one of the most controversial figures in Detroit. His first major move was acquiring Dodge Brothers in 1928. Now, this was not a friendly acquisition. The Dodge brothers, John and Horace, had built one of the most respected car companies in America before both died unexpectedly in 1920. Their widows sold the company to a banking syndicate, which then tried to run it themselves. The results were predictably disastrous. By 1928, Dodge was losing market share and hemorrhaging money. Chrysler smelled blood. He approached the bankers with an offer that was honestly kind of audacious. He proposed to acquire Dodge Brothers not with cash, but with Chrysler stock. The bankers would become shareholders in Chrysler Corporation, and in return, Chrysler would get Dodge's factories, dealer network, and brand name. The deal was worth approximately $170 million, one of the largest corporate acquisitions in American history at that time. And Chrysler pulled it off without spending a single dollar in cash. See, this is what made Walter Chrysler so dangerous. He wasn't just an engineer. He was a financial strategist who understood leverage, timing, and the psychology of desperate men. The bankers holding Dodge didn't want Chrysler stock. They wanted out, and Chrysler knew that their desperation gave him all the power in the negotiation. The acquisition of Dodge transformed Chrysler Corporation overnight. Suddenly, Chrysler had the manufacturing capacity to compete directly with Ford and GM. The company went from producing around 190,000 cars per year to over 450,000. By the end of 1928, Chrysler had become the third largest automaker in the world. But the way he achieved this success made him enemies everywhere he went. Walter Chrysler had a particular habit that drove his competitors insane. He poached their best people, and I don't mean he made polite offers that employees could decline. I mean he systematically identified the most talented engineers, designers, and managers at rival companies and then offered them salaries so extravagant that refusing was almost impossible. The most famous example was Fred Zeter, Owen Skelton, and Carl Breer, three brilliant engineers who had been working at Studebaker. Chrysler recruited all three of them in the early 1920s and made them the backbone of his engineering department. The trio, known collectively as the Three Musketeers, would go on to design nearly every significant Chrysler vehicle for the next 2 decades. Studebaker was furious. They accused Chrysler of corporate espionage, of stealing trade secrets, of conducting raids on their talent pool. The accusations were never proven in court, but they didn't need to be. Everyone in Detroit knew what Walter Chrysler was doing. He was building his company by dismantling everyone else's, and he didn't stop with engineers. Chrysler recruited production managers from Ford, sales executives from General Motors, and financial officers from wherever he could find them. His compensation packages were legendary, and legendarily resented by the companies he was raiding. The thing is, Chrysler didn't particularly care what people thought of him. He cared about results, and the results spoke for themselves. By 1929, the Chrysler Corporation had introduced 3 distinct brands: Chrysler, Dodge, and Plymouth. The Plymouth brand was specifically designed to compete with Ford and Chevrolet at the low end of the market. It was cheap, reliable, and utterly unremarkable in design, which was exactly the point. Chrysler understood that most American families didn't want innovative engineering. They wanted a car that worked and didn't cost too much. The Plymouth sold hundreds of thousands of units in its first year. Combined with Dodge and the flagship Chrysler brand, the company was now offering vehicles at every price point. This was the strategy General Motors had pioneered, and Chrysler had copied it shamelessly. Alfred Sloan, the president of GM, was reportedly apoplectic when he saw how quickly Chrysler had replicated his business model. But here's where we need to talk about the darker side of Walter Chrysler's success, because the man who built one of the great American companies was also capable of extraordinary cruelty when it suited his purposes. During the Great Depression, Chrysler Corporation survived while dozens of competitors went bankrupt. This wasn't just luck. Walter Chrysler made calculated decisions that prioritized the company's survival over the welfare of his workers and suppliers. In 1932, at the depth of the Depression, Chrysler slashed wages across all his factories by up to 25%. Workers who had been making decent middle-class salaries suddenly found themselves struggling to pay rent. When unions tried to organize in response, Chrysler hired private detectives to identify labor organizers and had them fired. He wasn't alone in this. Most major manufacturers did the same thing. But the brutality of his response was notable even by the standards of the era. Suppliers fared even worse. Chrysler was famous for demanding price cuts from his parts manufacturers, and he wasn't gentle about it. If a supplier refused to lower prices, Chrysler would simply stop ordering from them and find someone else. Dozens of small companies that had depended on Chrysler contracts went out of business during the Depression. Walter Chrysler expressed no public remorse. His philosophy was simple and, honestly, kind of chilling. The strong survive, and the weak get eaten. He had survived by being stronger and smarter than everyone else, and he expected the same from anyone who did business with him. Now, in fairness, this ruthlessness is part of why Chrysler Corporation still exists today, when hundreds of other car companies don't. The decisions Walter Chrysler made during the Depression, cutting costs, maintaining quality, building cash reserves, positioned the company to emerge from the economic collapse in better shape than most of its competitors. By 1936, Chrysler was profitable again, and by 1940, it was larger than it had ever been. But the human cost of that survival was real, and Walter Chrysler never seemed particularly troubled by it. What did trouble him, surprisingly, was his legacy. As he entered his 60s, Walter Chrysler became increasingly concerned with how history would remember him. He commissioned the Chrysler Building in New York City, that gorgeous Art Deco skyscraper that was briefly the tallest building in the world, not because he needed office space, but because he wanted a monument. The building was completed in 1930, and for 11 months it held the record for the world's tallest structure. Then the Empire State Building surpassed it, and Chrysler was reportedly devastated. He had spent years planning the tower, obsessing over every detail of its design, and in the end, someone else had built something bigger. There's something almost poignant about that. Here was a man who had conquered the automobile industry, who had built one of the great corporations of the 20th century, and who had more money than he could ever spend. And what bothered him was that someone else had a taller building. Walter Chrysler retired from active management of his company in 1935, though he remained chairman of the board until 1940. His health had been declining for years. Decades of 18-hour days and constant stress had taken their toll. He spent his final years in his Great Neck, Long Island estate, watching from a distance as his company navigated the challenges of the late Depression and the approaching war. He died on August 18, 1940, at the age of 65. The obituaries were respectful but measured. The New York Times called him a genius of organization and production. The Detroit Free Press praised his engineering vision, but notably absent from the coverage was any mention of warmth, of generosity, of the human connections that usually fill these kinds of remembrances. Walter Chrysler had been respected, he had been feared, he had been envied. But it's not clear that he had been loved by anyone outside his immediate family. And what of the company he built? The Chrysler Corporation would go on to become one of the defining institutions of American industry. It would produce iconic vehicles like the Jeep, the minivan, and the muscle cars of the 1960s and 70s. It would survive near bankruptcy in 1979, government bailouts, mergers with foreign companies, and more near-death experiences than any automaker should reasonably endure. As of today, the Chrysler brand still exists, barely, as part of Stellantis, the massive conglomerate formed by the merger of Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot. Walter Chrysler probably wouldn't recognize the company that bears his name. But he would almost certainly understand the forces that shaped its evolution: competition, consolidation, the relentless pressure to adapt or die. What of his rivals? Alfred Sloan, the General Motors president, who watched Chrysler copy his strategies, went on to become one of the most celebrated business executives in American history. The Sloan School of Management at MIT bears his name. He outlived Walter Chrysler by more than 2 decades, dying in 1966 at the age of 90. Henry Ford, whose Model T had started the whole industry, never forgave Chrysler for entering his market. The two men were cordial in public but apparently despised each other in private. Ford considered Chrysler an upstart and an imitator. Chrysler considered Ford a dinosaur who couldn't adapt to changing times. They were probably both right. And the thousands of workers, suppliers, and competitors who were crushed along the way? History has largely forgotten them. That's usually how it works. We remember the winners. We remember the buildings they put up and the companies they founded. We don't remember the people who paid the price for their ambition. Walter Chrysler was, in many ways, a quintessentially American figure. He came from nothing, worked obsessively, took enormous risks, and built something lasting. He was brilliant and driven and completely convinced of his own righteousness. He was also capable of real cruelty when it served his interests, and he never seemed to lose much sleep over the damage he caused along the way. Was he a great man? That depends on how you define greatness. He was certainly a consequential one. The automotive industry he helped shape defined 20th century America in ways both wonderful and terrible. The cars his company built gave millions of people freedom and mobility. The manufacturing techniques he pioneered became templates for industries around the world. The corporate structures he created, for better or worse, are still with us today. But greatness implies something more than just impact. It implies character, wisdom, some concern for the broader good. And on those measures, Walter Chrysler's record is decidedly mixed. He was a man who loved machines more than people, a man who saw business as warfare and treated it accordingly, a man who built an empire and didn't much care who got crushed in the process. And that is the story of Walter Chrysler. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments. Had you heard of Walter Chrysler before this? Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.